I'm not sure I've majorly thought about it, but it's an interesting thought experiment. What's something we might do in our Western country, in Australia or New Zealand? We just go about our regular everyday life. That if we transported that and did it in another part of the world, that we could be thrown in prison or tortured or possibly even killed. We're going to talk about this difference that occurs in our world, especially for those of a faith perspective, a Christian faith belief. For those who say, hey, look, I'm following Jesus, and the mass persecution that is occurring for them. From Open Doors, Nathan Holland is joining us on the podcast today as we talk about the World Watch List, which rates the top 50 countries around the world for persecution of those who have a Christian belief. We want to hear some of the stories. We also want to talk about what we might actually do in making a difference. That's coming up today on the podcast. Please rate, review, share this with others. It helps us get the word out to more and more people. All right, let's have a chat with Nathan. G'day, Nathan.
G'day, Clayton. Great to be here today.
It's good to have you in. And, you know, the name of the program's Towards Understanding. We try and head towards some sort of better understanding in our world. And we really are going to do a bit of a deep dive on one topic, which is actually what Open Doors is all about. Could you talk to us a little bit about what Open Doors does and maybe even a little bit of how it started?
Yeah, so Open Doors started through the faith and life of a man named Brother Andrew. Maybe some of the listeners would know him as God Smuggler through the work that he did. In 1955, he started smuggling Bibles into the Soviet Union at a time where being in possession of a Bible, of the Word of God, was illegal or restricted. And so from there started the ministry of Open Doors, which is now working in over 72 countries, serving the persecuted and strengthening the church. When Brother Andrew started Open Doors, he said, we called this organization Open Doors because we literally believe that any door is open, anytime and anywhere. Every door is open to go in and talk about Jesus, as long as you are willing to go and you are not worried about coming back. And so we're an organization that's really dedicated of coming alongside communities of faith all over the world that we say are persecuted, and by that we mean like face significant challenges for following Jesus, maybe face forms of persecution that we refer to sometimes as smash persecution, like there would be churches that are attacked or bombed or face difficulty, but sometimes even what we call squeeze persecutions, maybe not having access to economic opportunities, simply for following Jesus. And so that's what we do at Open Doors.
Yeah. We're going to dig into each of those just that little bit more. And let's maybe just sit a bit around this idea of persecution as well. And you know, people listening across Australia and New Zealand, somebody who might have a faith perspective, a Christian faith perspective, might at times go, well, someone might make a bit of fun of me or ridicule, and maybe the word persecution gets thrown around a little bit. I think there's probably be others of other faith who are saying, well, actually, I feel like I probably have been persecuted even in these countries. The level of what sort of goes from, well, people being a bit annoyed by that or me being sort of laughed at versus, all right, well, this is persecution. Like, is there a way you actually can draw a line to say, well, that's what we actually mean, that side's that side, this side's that side, and then there's different levels on both sides as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so important to discover what is the scale of persecution you can experience. Like, as you mentioned, people might have experienced maybe like a comment that was untoward because of their faith journey. And yeah, okay, we'll put that on the scale, but what are some other things on that scale as well? And so like the World Watch List, which is a research index of the most persecuted places, can sometimes be a really helpful place to look that Open Doors releases that shows what are the places where believers face the most severe to extreme levels of persecution. And so say, here we might receive a comment or an awkward family moment for going on a faith journey. But in some parts of the world, people are put in prison for being in possession of a Bible. And so that's on a different scale of persecution. And so we're Open Doors. We like to say that like we're coming alongside the most persecuted places. Yeah. So places where we see that it is sometimes quite confronting or extreme what people are experiencing simply for following Jesus.
Yeah. All right, we're going to dig into that too. you talked about the World Watch list, and this is a list that is put out. Is it yearly that this gets put out?
Yeah, it's yearly updated.
Yep.
Yeah.
And this is the top countries in the world that actually have persecution for those in a Christian faith. It is specifically around that. It's the top 50 that get marked on a whole lot of various things from. Is there violence, the impact in national life, in your private life, all these sorts of areas. Before we sort of dig in a little bit to that, how do you actually know this? Like, if some of these countries are so tight down in terms of North Korea is the top country there, right? Like, we know it's really hard to get into North Korea. How do you actually do the research to know what the impact is? Like, how do we know it's reliable, I suppose, is what I'm asking.
That is a great question. I think Open Doors primarily works through our relational network. So for all of these places, we actually have teams or local partners on the ground that, on one hand, are doing the work there that we Open Doors are wanting to do in seeing an impact in these places. They're also reporting on specific cases of persecution that they've seen. And so the World Watch List is published by Open Doors International every year. It's audited by the International Institute of Religious Freedom every single year to make sure that it is a responsible and trustworthy index. And so even you'll see asterisks all over it talking about how conservative even our numbers and our methodology is, because we know that if an organization like ours was sensationalistic, you lose integrity very quickly. And so we're even on the conservative end of reporting upon Christian persecution. And if anybody wants to see the methodology behind the World Watch List, even as you were saying, highlighting pressure or persecution in different aspects of someone's life, like family, community, church, how they integrate with society, it's a really good research index to see what are the places where believers face the most extreme levels of persecution.
Yeah. Now, we're going to talk a bit more about this, but good time perhaps to say that this is easily accessible for anyone to go and have a look at. How do they actually what website is that?
Yeah, so opendoors.org.au, and you'll be easily able to access the World Watch List from there, which on the website, you can easily see the top 50, but if you click on an individual country, you'll find multi-page dossiers even highlighting specific examples of persecution. And so if we talk about a country or a place that you might be, I didn't realize there was maybe persecution there, that's a great place to go just to see some of the research we have backing some of the things that we're talking about.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about it. There's definitions in there on what you mean when you say, okay, what restrictions are around private life, all those sorts of things. And so let's talk a little bit about what this is. The countries are always the interesting ones that we look at. We talked about North Korea is the top there. And talk to us about why does North Korea score like essentially 97 out of 100 of persecution. Talk to us, how does that come about? What is happening in North Korea to really sort of paint the picture, I suppose?
So in the 30-plus year history of the World Watch List, North Korea has actually been number one for every year but one. And so we see that in North Korea, particularly one of the main forms of persecution is what we refer to as dictatorial paranoia. So simply someone making the claim that they want to be a follower of Jesus is seen as political dissidence to Kim Jong-un. And so it's fascinating how in Australia and New Zealand, we can sometimes separate our different aspects of our lives. We've got our religious life, our work life, and our political views. But in places like that, they blur together. And so even though there's a statement of wanting to follow Jesus, that's seen as you're a political enemy to the regime in North Korea today. And so we estimate that there's about 400,000 secret believers in North Korea. I actually had the opportunity of sharing at a church in Ballarat where they showed me a plaque of a woman who was sent there in the late 1800s. That was one of the key individuals that helped lead a revival in North Korea, where Pyongyang at the turn of the 1900s was called the Jerusalem of the East. So if anyone wants to look into that, it's called the Pentecost of Pyongyang, this incredible revival. And so the believers there are still following Jesus as a legacy of a move of God that happened there over 100 years ago. And so, but they go through such extreme persecution. Sometimes if a believer is simply discovered in possession of a Bible, they're taken away. This is what happened to a woman named Jihu. Her father was discovered with a Bible in their home, and she said that one day secret police came and she hasn't seen her father since. And through our incredible team in China, we've been able to smuggle radios into that country where secret Christians there can then hear the word of God being broadcasted. And Jihu, she understands the risk. She knows the risk that she's taking in listening to the word of God, but she goes, I need to be listening to the Bible for my faith to be fed. So yeah.
So North Korea's been there pretty much every time. What are some of the ones in the last year or so that have had the biggest movements on this list? The ones that are actually saying, look, they've really increased in persecution for those who might have a Christian belief.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think ones that I know that have been big movers, particularly in the top 10, are countries like Yemen. We have seen such a crackdown upon communities of faith in Yemen by Houthi rebels, particularly as the geopolitical conflicts in that area. Sometimes Christians are a target in these places because they're perceived as being a Western influence in that country. And so a country like this that is having conflict with Western countries then sees their Christians as a part of their country that is not aligned with the government. So we see that persecution's been cracking down there. We also see that Syria has been one that's jumped up. I know it would have been the end of 2024, we saw the Assad regime fall. And under the Assad regime, there was persecution to believers in Syria. There was suffering happening to a lot of Syrians under that regime. But with the new power that came through, there was so much uncertainty towards Christians. And there we've seen such a spike of attacks, which was primarily seen on the 22nd of June last year. St. Elias Church in Damascus had the tragic circumstance of a suicide bomber walking in during a service. And so that attack left over 11 people killed and many people deeply affected by that incident of persecution. And we at Open Doors, we've been able to come alongside some of the families and trauma care and helping walk alongside believers practically. And I was so impacted by, there's a man, Elias, who he lost some extended family members in that attack, and he has an injury on his leg that makes it very difficult for him to walk. And he said, when you think about your dinner, you only need a little bit of salt to make it salty. And he said, we will continue to be the salt of the earth here in Damascus, which I just thought is such an incredible resolve of a man of faith to have walked through what he's walked through, but to go, we will keep being light to darkness. We'll keep being the salt of the earth here in Damascus. Yeah,
great bravery because of that faith that he's walking into. My guest is Nathan Holland from Open Doors. We're going to talk a bit more about the World Watch List in a couple of minutes' time. I'm going to talk to him about are there some surprising entries that he wasn't sort of expecting this year on that list? We'll talk about that. And also, what does this mean? This is, super interesting in terms of to have a picture and an understanding of what is occurring in the world. What is some action that could actually be taken from that? Is there action that we can do? Or is it too hard to do that? His thoughts on that as well. On the way next here on Towards Understanding.
Share your brand, your event, your message across 90 Christian radio stations and major cities in Australia and New Zealand by sponsoring Towards Understanding, hosted by Clayton Bielen. More than 210,000 people tune into Towards Understanding each week, and with just one sponsorship, you'll reach this immense engaged audience. Find out more about this exciting and unique opportunity now on the sponsorship page at positivemedia.com.au.
Before we start talking about what are some of the practical things we might be able to do to help this, Nathan, were you surprised by some of the top 50 entries of places around our world that have persecution for those who are Christians?
Yeah, probably the most surprising one in the top 50 for me is number 19, which is the Maldives. And I think it's such a potent example about how sometimes Christian persecution can be hidden from Western eyes, because maybe one day you and I, Clayton, will go to the Maldives. We'll have a mocktail by the beach at a beautiful resort, and we'll come home and have a great experience. But if a local decides that they are going to be a follower of Jesus, they unfortunately can face extreme consequences that can affect their economic opportunities. Sometimes that even means that their family will reject them. And so even though someone like you or me can go and have a great time in that country, and so we might be really surprised that it's on something like the World Watch List, that there is highlighting the experience of a local who may be deciding to follow Jesus. But another surprising aspect that I find in the World Watch List is, you can look at the top 50, but when you go into some of the statistics, probably the most confronting statistic for me comes from Nigeria. Now, I think people may be aware of the persecution happening in Nigeria. It started to enter into the news cycle about the midway through last year. But Open Doors research shows that for every 10 Christian that was martyred for their faith, so for every 10 Christian that lost their life simply for following Jesus, 7 of them were from northern Nigeria. It can be such it's such a concentrated part of the world where Christians and followers of Jesus are facing such extreme forms of violence simply for following Jesus. And so I Open Doors, we've been able to work through local partners to provide trauma care to believers there. Like, one was a man named Ayuba. He witnessed horrific circumstances happen to his family. I won't speak of it just to be safe for all the ears that may be listening. But he said that he was resentful, he was bitter, he was actually wanting revenge. And after his time at a local Open Doors trauma care center, he said that, but I have now found peace, encouragement, and hope. I have learned how to forgive and leave everything at the feet of Jesus. And he said, and now if I'm to die like my father, so be it. I'm following Jesus. And so like that as well, we'd expect Nigeria to be high on the World Watch List, but that number of the severity there, I found really surprising when I first came to Open Doors.
Yeah. Overall, in terms of persecution, is there, as we look back 30 years, say, or whatever it might be, as the World Watch This has been done, is there greater persecution sort of en masse around the world for those who have a Christian faith now, or is it better? What is it when we look at it sort of in a big mass?
It's such a great question, and what we have seen through the World Watch List, if you go back through the World Watch List over the past 10 to 12 years, is the number of believers facing severe to extreme levels of persecution. So the number of believers facing persecution on that higher end has grown significantly.
And we're talking here like literal death because of their faith, or, permanent imprisonment or something like that, torture or whatever.
Yeah, believers facing those very severe to extreme levels, whether that's the physical violence or the pressure side of things. And so say in 2014, for example, there was 100 million Christians going through severe to extreme levels of persecution. And now 12 years later in 2026, there's 388 million Christians going through severe to extreme levels of persecution today. So that number has almost quadrupled in the past 12 years. And so I think that's worth highlighting, the number of believers facing these extreme cases of persecution has tragically increased around the globe in places like Asia, the Middle East, and sub-Saharan Africa particularly.
What do you think, and has the reports pulled out why that persecution has increased in that time? Are there triggers or reasons for why that's occurred?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think particularly in some parts of the developing world in Asia, we've seen that there's always been a sentiment towards persecution, but as technology has increased, the means towards surveillance, the ability to actually persecute believers in these areas has increased. As well, another part has actually been the growing Christian communities in these places, where the light of the gospel through the work that's being done with locals on the ground is going out in places like Iran. I know I've heard so much anecdotally and even from people on the ground that the underground church in Iran has been one of the fastest growing communities of faith in the world. And I don't think anybody expected that. But then the other side of that coin is the increased level of persecution. And so we see that wherever the gospel is growing in the dark parts of our world, that's such great news. That's such a good side to it. But we need to be aware of the other side, that there's an increased level of persecution for these people that are finding Jesus.
Yeah. You also talked about the fact that, and we've spent a lot of time on the World Watch List, so the reporting, the viewing of what Open Doors is doing and highlighting, right, which is a huge part of what this is. But there's also the work of it. You talked about the trauma counselling. What's some of the other work that, to give examples of what Open Doors is now doing, having identified these areas of what persecution is and actually going in and helping?
Absolutely. And so, we started with someone like Brother Andrew, who was traveling to these places. As the organization has grown, we now have local teams in those countries. And so, I've had the example of meeting someone named Bishop Daniel. He is a church leader in Iraq, and he was there in Iraq when ISIS invaded Mosul in northern Iraq. And he shared about how his church grew by 1,500 people overnight. It wasn't revival, it was Christians fleeing Mosul. And he shared with us how it was the local Open Doors partners on the ground that were immediately beside him, providing food, emergency relief to people there initially. And then when they discovered the significant trauma that the children had faced, which there's so many stories there, but he developed a resource with our local partners called Healing the Wounds of Trauma with the Holy Scriptures. And there's such a profound journey of healing that the children of that community experienced. And so we work through local partners and teams around the world where, when I say serving the persecuted and strengthening the church, by that I mean delivering Bibles to those who do not have access to Bibles. I mean training believers in how to respond to persecution in a biblical way, providing practical support for those who lose access to critical needs that we have, and what we call presence ministry, which is primarily this trauma care aspect. And I've had the privilege of going overseas and, meeting in people that are now heroes of the faith, for me, and seeing how significant it was having someone stand alongside them in their moment of persecution. A story that I'll never forget is a woman named Shayna, where she planted a church alongside her husband, and they tragically were attacked, and she was gunned down in front of her home, and she so sadly lost her husband to that attack. I'll never forget her showing me the x-ray of the bullet still lodged between the vertebrae of her spine. And so it's a miracle that Shayna can walk today, but the journey of trauma care through her son, that her son experienced, was so significant. And she said that was the greatest burden for her over the next decade, and walking through that darkness and coming out the other side where her son now loves Jesus is something she's so grateful that there were people around the world willing to stand alongside her and walk with her in that suffering. And that's been something that's impacted me, that when I hear about persecution, that's a family. That's a community being affected. And it just really does bring it home in that way.
Love that. Do you know how many people you actually impact each year? Or can you even actually properly do that? In that sense, because you're sort of having different conversations with this group, and maybe are you impacting 1 or 20? Is there ways that you can actually know how many people you're impacting?
Yes, if you go into our website and you go to the About and the Your Impact, you can actually see the impact that Open Doors has had in the last year. Last year, we were able to help over 6 million Christians in the most persecuted places continue to follow Jesus through the work I was sharing earlier, like Bibles, training, practical support, trauma care. And so we want to see that number grow. As we say, that there's 388 million Christians facing severe to extreme persecution. And so we're grateful for the impact that has happened, but we're wanting to show the church all over the world that they are not alone.
Yeah. So let's get a bit practical. Things people can do right now to actually help in this specific way. My take, and see if you're correct with this, is that I think there's probably an opportunity to give and donate to Open Doors. I think there's opportunities to pray if you're somebody who is saying, well, I'm a Christian believer, I'm going to pray here. Are there other ways as well, and maybe expand on how they can do the first two as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I've been so impacted by every persecuted believer that I've met. They are desperate for us in Australia and New Zealand to be praying for them. And I think it's because they believe in the power of prayer. And so if people want to go onto our website, you can sign up to be receiving our prayer resources there. That will give you updates, like even the updates that have happened the past few weeks that come out from places like Nigeria, where girls from a Baptist school were abducted. And so, we asked the church in Australia and New Zealand to be praying for them. And so you can hear about events of persecution around the world as it happens, for you to respond in prayer. If you're someone who would like your community of faith to have a moment praying for the persecuted church, the International Day of Prayer for the persecuted church is the first Sunday of November, which this year is the 1st of November. And so they can go onto our website at opendoors.org.au/get-involved/International Day of Prayer. Maybe just go to the website and you'll be able to navigate there. And last year there were over 1,000 churches in Australia and New Zealand that took 5 minutes or 30 minutes to hear these stories and pray for their persecuted brothers and sisters. And so people can do that. They want to do that with their community of faith. And of course, if you'd like to give, it's only through the generosity of believers in Australia and New Zealand that organizations like Open Doors can happen. And, if the church doesn't come alongside the persecuted church, who will? And so just so people know, in our work of Bible smuggling, that's the work Brother Andrew started and still going along today. $200 helps us smuggle 10 Bibles into places where believers face extreme levels of persecution. And so, of course, that cost is mainly the smuggling, or the delivering, we'll say. And so people can help in that way. And we also have an exciting opportunity coming up for the listeners in Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne. We're going to be hosting an Open Doors live event. And so if you want to find more information about that, it'll be www.opendoors.org.au/live, where we're having Pastor Fred, a leader from the church in Nigeria, come and share about his experience of leading communities of faith in the context like northern Nigeria. And so it's going to be such an incredible opportunity for us here, sorry for everyone else, but in Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne, to be connecting with that. And so they can find that on our website, opendoors.org.au/live.
Yeah, and that's actually this upcoming week.
Yeah, this upcoming week. So we're in Brisbane on Thursday the 27th of August at River Life Baptist, Sydney on Saturday the 29th and Sunday the 30th, and then in Melbourne on Saturday the 5th of September.
Excellent. Nathan, it's been wonderful having a chat with you. Thank you for the information, the encouragement, the inspiration, and also for painting a picture of, these darker parts of the world where maybe we can be actually doing something in prayer, in giving, and in hearing those stories as well. So thank you for the work you're doing, and thanks for coming in.
Thank you so much, Clayton. It's been such a joy. Thank you.
Nathan Holland from Open Doors, my guest on Towards Understanding.